Welcome back, everyone, to the Elusive I, the nature and the function of the self, with my good friends and co-interlocutors, Gregg Enriquez and Christopher Master-Pietro. We are in the midst of a very rich and I think thought-provoking and insightful journey with Gregg on what he's sort of broadly calling the therapeutic and clinical dimensions of the self. How does this model that we've worked together to build, a theoretical model of the self, how does that align with and how may afford and respond to the clinical dimensions of the self that are so prominent in Gregg's work? So I'm just going to now pass things over to Gregg and let him take the reins.
Thanks so much, friend. Yes, it's so last time we were really speaking to sort of some of the more initial theoretical elements. So in the sense that, when on my updated tripartite map of consciousness, human consciousness, is basically a domain of the experiential self, what I call the experiential self, the private narrator, more the egoic functions, and the public management self. And then what we showed last time was how your model of the self, the cognitive science architecture that we've built over the course of this dialogue.
Oh, he cut out for me.
Yeah,
Gregg, you still there?
Gregg?
Oh, you're back.
Yep, well, I lost you guys. Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
Over the course of the dialogue, sorry about that. Over the course of the dialogue, it showed sort of what that model of the self enriched for us, okay? In terms of it sort of gives this layered perspective emerging out of qualia, and then have modeling of just the agent arena environment, modeling of the self-other environment, and how that kind of get mapped by the influence matrix, and then you have the adverbial I positioning itself, and then sort of perhaps on top of that or adjacent to that, this justifying narrator. And for me, what that does is, so now as a clinician, basically what I would say is, oh, wow, that provides a lot of sort of cognitive science justification for what I'm working with. And now we can sort of then say, hey, okay, how is it that I experience somebody in the clinic room? And what I'd like to do then is that, I'll start on that journey and talk a little bit about this. And we can put this in the show notes. I'll tell you a little bit about a case that I'm fortunate enough, based on a successful case that I'm fortunate enough to be able to talk about. So if I share the screen real fast, and I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between PowerPoints, as is my tendency in terms of this. So, so essentially, I'll share a little bit of what we call Maggies Story. This is actually a snapshot of the first session with Maggie. She afforded us the opportunity to talk about her story. So right here, she's basically just asked to leave. Said, I don't want to be here. Her friend brought her in relationship to, her friend had walked in on her as she was cutting on herself. And she had a long history of anxiety and social anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. Unfortunately, there was an incident with her boyfriend, which you might imagine a traumatic incident with her boyfriend. That was, very injurious to her. And she had no way of processing this. So it sat kind of like a psychic cancer on her soul in relation. In her senior year, she had gotten some relief. She had made some friends, had done pretty well. But when she came to college, she had this idea that, that she would be freed from her past.
Right.
But unfortunately, when she got here, other people hooked up, made friends. She didn't find a particular niche. And all of a sudden, very quickly, as what she thought was going to escape her past then cascaded into a collapse. So that over the 6-week period, so this is in the middle of October. So she, arrived in the end of July, end of August into the beginning of September. So we're 6 to 8 weeks in to the session. She's a freshman. Interestingly, she was 17 years old, and she was just about ready to turn 18. It's an ethical dilemma as to whether or not you can treat somebody as who, there's issues along that line. So that was interesting because she did not want her parents to know at all in relation. So that was interesting. And she was actively suicidal. She'd cut on her wrists, and then her friend walked in. So she's a cutter. And then her friend walked in saw some of the blood, and then Maggie freaked out and left. Thankfully, her friends followed her. She climbed up on the top of a bridge and got off on the other side of the guardrail. And thankfully, their friends talked her down from that. And then they stayed with her that night, and then they brought her in the next day. And so this is the next day from that in relation. And so my doctoral student, did a screen, said, hey, she pretty quickly told him about the, quasi-attempted suicide of the night before. And so I was in class, I got a call, and I was like, all right, I'll come on down. Gave her some things to fill out. And then I arrived on the scene. As soon as I got there, she was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I'm out of here. So that's not an uncommon frame of reference. And so then we, joined together and talked about the process of what the various options were. I had to tell her, if she left at that time, I would have had to call the cops at that stage, unfortunately, because she was in an obvious high risk to herself. So we had to get a place where she was going to be safe. And so that's a 2.5, 3 hour process. But ultimately then, we established a healing environment and a working relation and started on a journey in relation to that. I thought I would bring her up because what happened to her is a really pretty intense but classic example of what I see in many, many individuals these days in terms of the struggles that they have with their interior, the internalizing processes of the self in terms of what kind of pain they feel, emotional pain, what it means to them relationally, what it means to them in relationship to their internal narrator and how they try to portray themselves publicly. So a very, very classic experience that I see is individuals who have high trait neuroticism, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means, but basically that emotional system, the basic qualia into the negative affect system, idles very high. You're gonna wonder why that is in relationship to development. But what I see at least, there's a lot of data for this in terms of sort of, especially in women in puberty, what we see is an explosion of internalizing disorders in say 12, 13 year old individuals. And what I believe is happening, and I think there's a lot of evidence for what's happening, is that as that negative anxiety system comes online, as the sense of social place and social status becomes very salient, there's a lot of evidence that all of a sudden that one's social place, social judgment, social comparison becomes very salient concerns. And then the capacity for a higher order narrating identity. Who am I? What should I be? What should I feel? What should I want to feel? Sets the stage for a pretty vicious cycle, what I would call a neurotic loop. And the neurotic loop cycle is you have a negative reaction to negative feelings. Okay? And essentially, so you have a sensitized negative feeling system, a vulnerable relational field system, like I feel like I'm under threat, and a narrator that wants to be not to be either in pain or observed to be negatively reactive. So you're trying to sit on a emotional system that is jumpy, but you don't want to come across as hypersensitive or reactive, and your friends want you to be happy and everything else. So it's a very, very sort of tenuous system, and then it sets the stage for all sorts of justification dynamics relative to affect, meaning like, stop this way, don't be this way. And she really embodied this in a huge way at multiple levels. Basically, she lived essentially in a world by herself. She would not she never told her parents anything about what was going on with her. And indeed, this is actually one of the very dramatic moments in the therapy down the road. She ends up buying into the therapy. We have a good first couple of weeks, into 6 weeks or so, right before the Christmas holiday. She actually has an episode where she was cutting. We had minimized her cutting, but she was cutting a little bit. Her physician noticed that, asked some questions, and told her mom that he was concerned about her. That was a reveal for her that was very upsetting. She was ruminative about that. And then ultimately that created a cascade of another suicidal episode at the end of the semester. And she then went in, and then I guided her into the hospital. and this is not an uncommon thing, if you can set up a system so that the individual can experience the hospital as healing, which is definitely not always the case, but I actually had a hope that in this case, it might be, and my hopes turned out to be well-founded. So what happened in the context of this is we were able to catalyze an opportunity for her to reconnect with her mother. So her mother visited the hospital, and that gave me an opportunity to assess her mom, because she talked about how critical her mom could be or judgmental. And when you're dealing with an individual like this, it's very hard to know whether this assessment is a projection of sensitivity to mom, or whether mom is really harsh and critical, because folks like this will see the world through their glasses, and their glasses are everybody's critical. So this afforded me an opportunity then to meet with mom and make my own assessment. And indeed, mom shared with me that something happened to her daughter. She knew the light went out with her daughter's eyes, was the way mom put it. And when she was 15, and she never knew what happened, but never knew how to approach her, never knew how to approach Maggie, but clearly cared deeply and had a capacity to be sensitive, but just didn't know. Maggie was one of the hypersensitive child, and the mom just had no idea. We were able to engender an opportunity for the two of them to have a conversation and to open up lines of communication that had heretofore not been available. And she was then able to tell her mom that she was raped by her boyfriend when she was 15. That was a cascade of shame. And it turned out the episode happened when she snuck out and drank a bit when she was 15. So she snuck out of her bedroom. She was convinced that her parents would basically then blame her for the episode, given that she disobeyed them and violated some of the rules. And we were very fortunate, and I had tested mom's waters on this, and I was very pleased. And this was a great example sort of the self in terms of its potential for a phase shift. So mom basically handles this story, and we have a 3-hour session or so together where Maggie's able to reveal this, and you can imagine what this is like for her in terms of super intense social anxiety, massive amounts of shame, terror in relationship, and massive amounts of anticipation of judgment and alienation. And then thankfully, what happens is the reverse of that. So her expectation is, or the anticipated fear, if we do some predictive processing and internalized modeling that she's done an enormous amount of, is how could you let me down, you made this happen to you. And of course then, or what really happened, and thankfully, like I said, I tested the waters, is that mom's reaction was maternal. Oh my God, honey, I can't believe this happened to you. That just because you snuck out doesn't mean you deserve to got raped. And I knew something horrible had happened, and I've wondered all these years what happened. And I would want it to be there for you, but I had no idea how. And so we've talked some about that. Self-modeling is such a sort of key structure of where you are and how, whether or not you're attached. And her modeling was basically like, if anyone knew who she was and who she was and what she had been, they would see her as this horrible person. But that was essentially a distorted self-critical lens that had gotten entrenched over years of injury and blame and hiding and projection and negative reinforcement, where she engages in safety behaviors. And so then what happens is mom, basically reaches to her, holds her, and pulls her close and affords her a mirroring and a love that she was not expecting, and that resulted just in a cascade of changes for Maggie. It was a very, very moving, self-transformative event that laid the groundwork then for really the next year of therapy that we engaged in terms of that. So to me, the reason I wanted to share that is that it's a real life, documented sort of example of what happens to individuals, initially in relationship to how they can turn against themselves, how the narrator, the emerging online narrator, fearing the public and feeling the pain, but becomes completely sort of self-absorbed in its own structure. You multiply a trauma on top of that, and you can then channel that system. That system can go into a nightmarish place anyway, but you multiply a trauma on top of that, and you can find yourself in a really, really dark place. So that's Maggie's story in relation The blog basically delineates that and delineates the process by which we were trying to kind of create in her an understanding of what was going on. And one of the reasons I also wanted to tell the story is that Maggie was not, I don't think she's terribly uncommon in that she had made a couple of serious suicide attempts in her junior year, the year following the rape. And that freaked everybody out. And they put her in she put the first time in a hospital, she was reluctant to go back, was not a helpful, I mean, it, maybe prevented her from making another suicide attempt immediately, but they basically medicated her, gave her a depressive diagnosis, and essentially narrated this in terms of biomedical disease terms and did no substantive sort of psychotherapeutic work, no exploration about this might be an origin of trauma, that she might have a social anxiety or avoidant personality disorder that's emerging, and what that would mean to the internal working model of the self. In fact, one of the things I afforded her very early was I gave her an interpretation of her structure in terms of what I call a shame-based depression. A shame-based depression is when the system, the judging system, it's very common in individuals to have an avoidant personality disorder. For those that don't know, an avoidant personality disorder is a structure that's kind of the opposite of a narcissist. So if you know what Trump looks like, okay, it's like, hey, I'm a winner, I'm the camp, very potentially combative, very willing to enter in the arena, a massive amount of assertion that you will win. The position of the avoidance is essentially the exact opposite. You're obsessed with sort of the fear of losing, and therefore you're chronically submitting and deferring and chronically feeling the sort of the white flag of shame and submission in relation. And the narrator of inadequacy and ineffectiveness becomes very, very dominant. It overlaps a lot with social anxiety disorder. But nobody had ever explained to her sort of this frame of reference. They basically medicalized it. And certainly it doesn't always happen, but it happens too often as far as I'm concerned, relative to what we can have access to. So if we take, the justifying top side and the internalizing modeling side that you laid out, John, what we really get is a very clear example of the ways in which vicious feedback loops of injury into the attachment, and then isolation, and then safety behaviors, but then an internalized narrative that makes somebody feel more and more isolated in a vicious sort of cycle sort of way that delivers a very critical self-judgment that ultimately dead ends the person and shuts them down motivationally, emotionally. And that's what we saw with her fairly dramatically. So her understanding of that and her capacity then to gain a metacognitive perspective in relationship to it and have some frame of reference so she could explain what was actually happening, as it often is the case in therapy, is a very, very valuable thing to gain some, mapping of the processes that the person's facing.
That was wonderful. Not the event, but your discussion of it, Gregg. And I'm glad you were able to so successfully help her. So a couple things that I would want to note, and maybe they're both notes and questions. One is that, throughout all of this is self-relevance and self-interpretation, self-modeling. And like you said, and the way this is self-organizing and the way it's extended and loops through the environment and loops through other people, picking up on a lot of the themes we've talked about. And so thank you for that. And then the way that self-organizing process can become malfunctional, but also how that carries within it the potential for healing. So all of that, I think, really builds very well. But I noticed the juxtaposition between your successful therapy and her initial treatment by the official sort of medical community. And I noticed maybe it's more of a question. It seems to me that precisely because there is no good model of the self and all of this machinery, even though the term is used so prevalently through psychology and through psychiatry, that whole dimension, the whole dimension of the self, did not come on to the therapeutic screen for them. And it was, like you said, it's basically, the disease model, the medicalization, and then all of that is not addressed. So it strikes me, and this is sort of a question, but posed as a statement, that you're giving us obviously this primary level where the model and the therapy are really, coherent with each other. But then it strikes me there's the meta level that this whole series is addressing, which is this construct is not just out there as a theoretical idea, right? It goes into the very guts of how we try to help people with some of the most serious issues. And if somebody does, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit aghast that the medical community can't see suicide in terms of the relationship that the self has to itself. Like, I mean, what? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm from the outside, and so I have the unjustifiable self-righteousness of the naive, but nevertheless, that strikes me as just incredibly conceptually myopic, if not theoretically myopic. It's like, how are you not thinking about the self machinery when you are confronting the phenomena of suicide? Like, what? Like that is not, I mean, in one sense it's a medical issue, but it's fundamentally a psycho-ontological issue, right? Like, animals aren't doing anything like this. Like, come on, this is so bizarre. And so I guess my statement in question is, like, am I reading this correctly? And what do you, like, how does that land with you? What would you respond to that point?
I'll try to be measured up to the point. So I appreciate your energy deeply. Okay? So and the reason I measure, listen, I've talked to a lot of psychiatrists. I mean, psychiatrists are not fools, at an individual level. Okay. But the institutional infrastructure, we talk about the meaning crisis.
Yep, exactly.
Okay? What has happened at the institutional level? And so psychiatry has basically gone through two major waves. Well, first there's a classification, then Freud comes along, and many individuals start to see the vast majority of psychopathology through a Freudian lens. And in many ways, there's an argument that, psychiatry gets taken over by an analytic lens that's deeply problematic, say from 1920 and mid-1950s. Okay. Right. And then you get the chemotherapy revolution in psychiatry. And it grows, and then to me, the way it grows, it becomes deeply problematic by the 1980s, so that the energy in psychiatry is very much then oriented towards, oh yeah, these are all brain disorders that we have diagnosed, and we're going to institutionalize them, the narrative around brain disorder, and then we're going to institutionalize the psychopharmacological treatments. I mean, if you look at the top 10 drugs that are, in terms of money, like 3 of them are psychiatric drugs, okay, of all, in terms of the amount of money, and then the idea that depression is a brain disease. Now even anxiety, I guess, is a brain disease. The medicalization of our problems, mental health problems, is really dramatic and painful. And then you see the consequences, both in terms of, say, turn on a TV, and be like, hey, if your first antidepressant didn't work, we have second antidepressants that we can take on top of that. You could, certainly in the US, we have in these ads all the time. It's sad to me. And so the energy and power that you have, and indeed, this is why this conversation is so important to me. If we had a dynamic functional model of the self, okay, like especially the ego, the experiential self, the embodiment of elements, we understand the process by which these parts, okay, it's a complex dynamic system that's in complex dynamic interrelation. Then you set it in a developmental framework, and the processes by which maladaptive loops can form through these parts is very reasonable, very obvious, and that's not a malfunction. So maladaptation happens at the level of learning and development that doesn't necessarily reduce to any part malfunction that would be operative at the neurobiological level. Those are totally different ontological categories. Yet medicine has to assent for it to be medical problems rather than just problems in living. Diagnosable diseases can't be just problems in living. They have to be medical harmful dysfunctions. That's the definition of a disease. So really, they're actually playing an ontological language game that forces essentially these categories to be placed at a lower level of analysis. And the damage that does to our society in meaning making is serious and tragic. And by the way, the blame also sits with the goddamn psychologists, because they have no ontological clarity about what the hell they're talking about, John. Yeah. Okay, so it's a common, I mean, this is what matters to me, because it's sort of like, Jesus, are we telling these kids? I mean, that's what happened. Oh, you just have a depressive disease. I mean, that's what she lived. After 2 weeks in the damn hospital, that's what she came away with, and meds. No talk therapy, no nothing. And that's an extreme, but it happens. It definitely happens. So it's painful and it's frustrating. And the meta message, talk about this, is why I wanted to hand this over to Chris at the level of what's the existential meaning of our condition in relation. Well, the psychiatric, narrative is strong and potentially toxic and corrupting.
Well, if I can say one more thing before Chris responds. I mean, it sounds like we're caught, we have just this profound Socratic ignorance of the self. And then we mask it with the romantic proclivity to identify the self with the autobiography of your uniqueness or something like that, which is completely useless, impotent to address the issues that you're addressing for this unfortunate woman. And both the Socratic ignorance and the romantic pretense, and I think it is fundamentally pretentious in profound ways. I should say decadent romanticism. I should qualify it. The decadent romantic pretense, because I don't want to tar all of romanticism with that brush. I apologize for that. Decadent romanticism. But nevertheless, that is pervasive in our culture. I think both of those, I mean, I don't want to reduce what's happening to a sociological issue. I'm not trying to be Durkheim here. But I mean, he did write his book on suicide precisely to show, right, that if your worldview cannot properly render a coherent meaning for people, you're going to see fundamental increases in suicide that are going to be independent of people's physiology, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the classic work showed. And I mean, that was written in the 19th century. So, I mean, it just strikes me as just how, in some ways I know, but the invective is coming up because I get the suffering that this woman was confronting is something that I'm aware of. And so the fact that we are so impotent and ignorant about the self in a way that is potentially fatal, I think I just want to thank you, Gregg, because I mean, it gives an edge to everything that we're talking about that is just crucial and important and even poignant. So thank you.
1,000 college kids kill themselves every year.
Yep.
So that's a lot of people. That's a lot of college students. So anyway, yes, come on.
Well, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, if we were to scale up this problem even more, I don't want to tip us into this conversation for too long, but I mean, the bed of Procrustes that you're talking about it in a psychiatric context, Gregg. But if we were to just talk about the medicalization of the self for a moment, like right. Think of where we are right now in COVID, right? Like this idea that that if you abridge your model of the self so thoroughly that it becomes confined, that its concerns become confined to the preservation of physical health, and everything besides becomes superfluous, becomes a kind of afterthought or adjunct, then effectively what you do is you annul the capacity of restoring the self's reflexive connection. And I mean, to me, it's just a scaled up version, I think, of the same problem. You can't confine people indefinitely from one another and from the world and not expect their spiritual health to fail for that exact reason, right? And the same abridging of the self is happening at a mass scale right now, and it's destroying people for the same reasons, I think. And in that case, it's not the psychiatric profession that's perhaps the perpetrator. It's exceeded to the level of the state, but it's the same myopia, I think.
Totally. And I think it goes to the meaning crisis. I think it goes to the point of what is the philosophical and scientific relative to theological message and context of narration that we are actually speaking to ourselves about, and it's like, I don't know. It's like, yeah, we're going to have serious problems with the absence of that collective narrative that's rich and wisdom orienting, as opposed to reductive and fragmented and chaotic and instrumental.
That was very excellent. I want to put another thing on it that I think is very complementary to this. And I noticed the shift in terms. And Chris, this reminds me of Han's work. I think it's in The Agony of Eros, where he talks about the elevation of health, especially physical health.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
I don't believe in a religion. I go to the gym, every day, and I pump out, and I do all this because I want to be healthy. And what is it to be healthy? And I noticed that what's happened when Gregg was relating his interaction, it was, it was around mental health. But when Gregg was laying out his model, he was talking about well-being. And that shift in vocabulary, I think, it points to that endemic thing you're talking about, Chris, about the truncating of well-being, and therefore the truncating of the self down to sort of health, which is understood itself in a very crude, and this is part of Han's critique, right? I'm pretty sure it's The Agony of Eros, where he makes that critique, and that. And health, do that. And it's in the end, it's like, yes, health is a value, but it's not synonymous with well-being. And so, wow, that I think the point you made, Chris, it lines up with Han very well. And Gregg, I noticed that when you talk about your own framework, you focus on well-being as your primary normative term, but that when you're talking on behalf of the institutional system, you switch, I think, naturally enough, to the mental health discourse, and that's a serious shift. That's a serious shift.
Right, and I'm really glad you picked that up, and it's central to getting, from my vantage point, much of what the unified approach, so there's unified theory, and the unified approach tries to do is afford us the bridging from a theory of human mental behavior that then angles us on psychological adaptation and development in a way that affords us a particular angle from the psychological doctor around mental health, but does so is then contextualized in relationship to optimal human functioning and well-being.
Right.
So then, so it's well then placed to then be like, yes, we want to reference this in relationship to what is the eudaimonic potential of individuals and groups and societies to afford us. And that has to be to me, that has to be the proper reference point. And that, by the way, is completely absent in psychiatry. All right. My friend Waldemar Schmidt, who's a long-term student in both psychiatry and psychology, but he is actually a pathophysiologist. So he's a professor of pathophysiology, studies the kidney and liver, makes a really great point in relationship to, say, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And he's like, the first thing that I learned as a pathophysiologist was, what does a healthy liver and a healthy kidney look like? That becomes then the model. What's the optimal functioning? The DSM has no picture of what a healthy individual looks like.
Exactly.
There's no frame of reference. It's just the absence of annoying, distressing, injurious symptomatology. Whatever that is, but what is that?
Well, there's an implicit normativity. The implicit normativity is, are you functioning well within a market economy?
There's that.
Right. Basically, no, but I mean, because I lectured on the DSM not that long ago, and it's like, it keeps coming down to, like, can you basically dress and clean yourself and keep up a job? That's what
becomes the bar.
Yeah.
That's the bar.
And like, what? But yeah, it's like our ontology of the self has become so impoverished that we have just dropped when we try to intervene in selves in a significant fashion. Okay, I could talk about this a lot because it plugs in, but I want to give things back to you. I want to give Sanders.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I'll come back to but I'm really glad we framed it this way, because this is why it's so passionate to me. Because the institutional narratives and ideologies that drive all of the money and the reimbursement and who we pay and what we do and how we entertain ourselves it's all embedded in a worldview context, and what it speaks to us and how we frame that is unbelievable. We mirror that back and give it back. And so if it's framed a particular way, it will impoverish the soul and spirit. And that's the whole point of like my whole frame is like, how the hell do we actually get a worldview? And so I care deeply about the work that we're doing, John, is precisely because the failure of psychology and cognitive science to afford us a coherent ontology that we actually understand what the hell we're talking about is crucial to this. And it's all that much more crucial if the ontology actually says, oh, actually, the spiritual concerns of existentialist philosophers and the Eastern wisdom traditions actually genuinely speak to something that we can bridge from a Western psychological cognitive science view and align that up and give people a message and a meaning-making system that actually affords fulfillment. Well, then we wouldn't have 1/3 of our college students being diagnosed with mental health problems and 1/4 of them being on pills for depression and anxiety. Well, I mean, at least that's the ideological, positive state. So anyway, there it is. I'm glad we got a little charged rhetoric in relation.
Well,
so
you see the poignancy of that kind of suffering, and I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that you were there, Greg. But when you see the poignancy of it, it provokes a kind of reaction. At least I think it should.
Well, I can vouch for that. I've seen that enough and felt it enough over the years, for sure. Definitely. Okay, so now let me go in more in a little bit of the intellectual arguments that I wanted to make in terms of as we move from here so now let's go. So psychiatry does this thing. So now I'm going to go back to my own intellectual awakening and basically like, hey, when you're getting trained, psychiatry's got its issues, and so does all of the mental health disciplines. So now it's sort of like, I'm going to go psychology. What's a psychological doctor to do in this situation? Well, it's really a problem at one level because there's a thing called the problem of psychotherapy, which is that psychotherapy is a jungle, okay? It's a jungle of different approaches. Like, what do you choose? Do you go Freudian? Do you go Rogerian? Do you go New Wave CBT? Do you go behavioral? Do you go family system, solution-focused, multicultural? I mean, how do you manage that? And that's essentially the difficulty that I encountered. And my sense was the following. It's like, okay, I want to afford the Maggies of the world the best opportunity and to find a path towards wisdom. I want to be as flexible and comprehensive in my giving them that affordance. I am a coherentist, which means basically I like to make sense out of shit. I know that's crazy, but that's my orientation. I like intelligibility and sensibility. Somebody said that was right. I heard from John that actually, plausibility and intelligibility are good things. I think I was born with that sensibility. So anyway, but they are really afford you a lot of interesting things, but actually it's a real problem. And indeed, then what my question was, well, actually, could you develop a human psychology that orients in relationship to the key insights of this jungle and do so in a way that affords meaning making so that these key insights can be assimilated and integrated into a whole package that becomes the vision and the quest that ultimately comes to unified theory and back into the unified approach.
So Greg, a quick question here, because it's on there, it's large. So my interaction with this community has been when you press people, therapists, they often self-disclose that they're eclectic. And so what I mean is that this isn't just a theoretical problem about there isn't a unified framework, but it's that in practice, people are trying to find some kind of integration, but they're doing it in a very fragmented, autodidactic kind of fashion. Is that a fair thing to say?
That's absolutely. The vast majority of people identify, if you survey therapists and counselors, the vast majority of them, if you ask the right questions in a particular way, they'll sort of have a home place, but they're basically eclectic. Okay.
Right.
And at the level of, if you then, hey, really good people doing good things, but if we were to bring theoretical, scientific, or philosophical rigor to that eclecticism, it's bad.
Right.
It's just sort of like, it's a hodgepodge of all these various things. As soon as you, and then you back up and you say, well, what's the ontological difference? Or do you have equivocation? And then, but believe me, John, remember, we don't even know what behavior and mind is. So when we back up into these concepts and then you drop them all together in particular types of frames, I mean, it's basically a shit show of confusion. So that's the problem. That's the standard practice.
So within the cognitive science, we have the conceptual morass of the self. And then within the self psychotechnologies, we have what you've just aptly described as the shit show.
The shit show, or the generalized conceptual morass, right? So there it is. So, and that's what my life quest sort of is actually, it doesn't have to be that way. And that's what's really, at least that's my argument, is actually, we can make a lot more coherent and then cumulative sense. And this isn't about finishing the project. This is actually getting the project started with the right field framing, a unified field framing that actually says, oh, these are what our terms can mean. Now we can actually build off of them. That's what I'm after. Not like, oh, being done by any stretch, just getting started, really, that I'm interested in. So, okay. So now, the way I came to frame this, like in the 1995, was the RFSB problem, okay? And so what that stood for is Rogers, Freud, Skinner, and Beck. What you see here is, you see in the bottom here, you got evolution and neurophysiology. So this affords us a perspective of from biology, and certainly psychiatry then operates there. And there's some individual human individual level of analysis of problem, with problem and psychotherapy pairing, and you get the major paradigms, okay? And the socio-cultural systems context sits above it. So you get biopsychosocial here, and the major figures at the individual human level can be well framed in relationship to these icons, okay? So although there certainly are variants along these lines, but if you were to say, all right, I'm going to take 4 iconic paradigms, schools of thought, and their leaders, you can do pretty well in terms of really mapping out, especially if you bracket off the biological and the sociocultural and family systems above.
Right.
Okay? So that was apparent to me in my own framing and my own work. Now, one of the things I want to share then is sort of like, okay, how I got here, and part of also what I'm saying is that and we've alluded to this already, is that I really want a model of character adaptation and functioning that's far more comprehensive than certainly personality trait theory. So ultimately, what's going to emerge is the unified approach that has these 4 different key insights. From the jungle, we get what's called character adaptation systems theory, which I'll go through here in just a second. This is the quick schematic of it. It's the 5th branch on the tree. And, we published this in a good journal if people are actually interested, and I can send links. But what I'm going to share is I had this model, okay, that you see, this is the basic model. And what I had found in applying this model is that each of the human individual perspectives focused on different patterns of adaptation, okay, that you can then elucidate and determine to see.
Oh, that's brilliant, Greg. That's brilliant.
Yep, that's so if you attend to what the psychotherapeutic processes are, okay, you see that actually the maladaptive systems they want to identify and then engender psychotechnologies to reverse and create more virtuous cycles. Well, they all actually use an adaptive or a maladaptive to adaptive cycle framing.
Right.
And at the same time, they lens or spectralize different aspects of the human psyche.
Right.
So this was the initial scheme I developed. So I teach integrative psychotherapy. So at the bottom here, you'll see the 3 broad contexts, okay? And then I talk to people about, hey, there's a behavioral habitual process of adaptation that people engage in. And then we can think about this in terms of clinically, in terms of your lifestyles. So what is the circadian rhythm of the day? What is the stimuli that prime particular cravings and tendencies for you to engage in? What are those procedural systems that you have access to that are downgraded and then just triggered by particular patterns and stimuli? And then how do you interact with the environment in sort of an engineering sort of way? Well, that's a habit and behavioral lifestyle frame. The evolution of Carl Rogers, and certainly in terms of sort of systematic psychotherapy, can be seen in terms of the experiential and Gestalt, like Fritz Perls, and then into what's called emotion focused therapy. I don't know if you've heard of emotion focused therapy.
I did training with Les Greenberg on emotion focused.
Oh, well, you damn well have heard of it then. He's one of the co-founders with Sue Johnson, who goes off and does it with attachment. Merges it with attachment, does couples therapy. But Les Greenberg is the founder, of course, what he calls a neo-humanistic emergence of being an emotion coach. And what the emotion focused people do, if you, Carl Rogers believed that people had this organismic valuing process that you would, if you empathize with and you attended to, well, we can see, you and I, John, can say, well, that's that valence qualia system, right? That then gets organized by affect. And by the way, now we can see very clearly based on your model, well, that would be the care, the base care of the self system. Right? And then trying to figure out what the alignment is the base care of the system. And then you can see, well, the social judgment of people and your internalized critic judgment, well, that's going to throw off the basic care. Right? And then if a good therapist comes along and says, I can detect what your organismic valuing process is through empathy and unconditional regard, then I can cultivate that growth in you. And then you'll reflect on that. And then you'll get coherent integration between your organizing potentially true self. And Rogers doesn't use that word that much, but many other therapists does, like Winnicott, and then into the social self. And so that you can then see that very much clearly as a aspect of the whole process. And I argue that all good therapy begins with Rogers. He really does know how to set the psychotherapeutic healing context. Then there are these relational systems. So then not only you have the base of the energy and the emotion system, but now you get the self-modeling system, starting with attachment and now tracking, am I loved? Am I, what's my power, my freedom, my love? How do I manage in terms of status? And then the conflict that I'll experience, like, hey, do I defer and get along with somebody, but I have to suppress my anger and self-interest, or to get really angry and suppress my guilt and affiliation? These core conflictual relations are very, very common. And then finally, that verbal I am justified because narrative gets into existential identity. And for therapy, what we're trying to do is cultivate a developmental process of awareness. I want to see where you are, cultivate awareness of what brought you in and what this is about, and then awareness of what your issues are, and then sort the process out of accepting that which you can't change, and then cultivating the skill and zone of proximal development toward change that you can.
Right.
So this was this game, and then through all these systems, there's also these filtering and defense mechanisms. So in 2008, 2009, or 2008 or so, this was my schema. Now, in terms of something interesting happened, and that is Dan McAdams and Jennifer, I think it is Jennifer Powles, produced a 2006 article in American Psychologist called A New Big Five, which basically I was bitching before about, personality shouldn't be traits, just traits. And this is actually an article in American Psychologist by Dan McAdams saying exactly that. It's saying that personality, an integrative science of personality, should be much more than traits. And they offer then a new big five. And what they mean by that, well, they frame personality, and we've discussed this some, but it really, the science of personality should be about a way a human person is like everyone else, and frames human nature, gives us individual differences, which is where the trait people have been focused on a lot, but also articulates how we're like no one else in terms of our uniqueness, and then afford us the appropriate schematic in relationship to that. And so what they do is they talked about the evolutionary genetic context, and that would be sort of consistent with what I've done. Traits as the foundation, then these character adaptations, which they called, and these are basically learned procedural and participatory capacities that you have. That's what a character adaptation is. Then you build an identity and adolescence on top of that, and you live in a sociocultural context. Okay, so for McAdams and Powles, when we think about personality, they argue that this should be the big five that we should think about, not, whereby the big five are then just located in one part of the five. Okay, so that was their frame. They didn't emphasize this, but they certainly would acknowledge this would go into a developmental context.
Of course.
Now, in the context of this article, McAdams and Powell says, hey, you'll never get a big five of character adaptations, because these the process by which individuals build unique skills or talents, they're as varied as shooting a basketball or what you do to prep your notes or any other number of learned behavioral repertoires, okay? However, I realized that actually what I was doing in these systems of psychotherapy adaptation was actually not so much delineating specific character adaptations, but I was delineating the adaptive modes or systems of adaptation that could then be played out. So it's not so much that there are going to be a big five of character adaptations, but there's a big five of character adaptation systems. You know, it's kind of like when you were like, hey, we'll never have a theory of relevance, but we can have a theory of relevance realization. You can actually have a theory of adaptive systems. And ultimately then, I then resulted in the development of the combination of really that insight, what I had developed in psychotherapy, the unified theory approaches then afforded then this particular map. And so what I'll share you now, and then that will then set up. So when I look at Maggie, who comes into the office, okay, as a psychological doctor, I'm going to now see her, certainly I'm going to see her overall well-being, okay? And then I'm going to be particularly attending to her character functioning, adaptation, and development, okay, in relationship to what her overall well-being is, her psychosocial well-being. And I will be thinking about it from her vantage point and then my vantage point through these particular lenses, okay? So this is the fifth branch on the overall tree. It looks like this. What you get is three different contexts, which we've actually seen repeatedly. There's a biological context that starts at, well, it's conception, and then represents your biophysiological line. Then there's a mental behavioral context, which is basically the agent arena relationship across time. Starts with your distal early architecture, most notably things like attachment, early learning structures, sensitive periods, and then the more recent changes that are happening that are salient in the individual's life. And then you're embodied in or born into a sociocultural context that has macro level values and belief structures, meso level community, like status issues, like what's your socioeconomic status, and then your particular family and personal relations that you have. That's a Bronfenbrenner. And then you have these five systems of adaptation that can then tell us about this basically translates from the systems that I shared before. We have habits, the experiential online system. So this is just me and the environment in particular. And then the relationship system is me as I model the self other world relation. The defensive system then really refers to the management and the coherent management of your primate self, which is represented in relationship to these three, into then the person self, which is the justifying system.
Right.
So then this, and what this does is we put the person in a context of stressors and affordances, what they perceive in the world and the paths of investment that they can, and like what we see with Maggie is really an intense, and you nailed this, and we see this absolutely, and I actually hadn't framed it exactly this way, but you get the reciprocal narrowing, of rumination, and collapse, and then everything gets, you get the, I used to just call it tunnel vision, which is basically the same thing. You get tunnel visioned into a particular set of loops, and we want to then reverse that cognitive cycle and create that reciprocal opening of flexible possibility in psychotherapy. But when you arrange it this way, so this then says, oh yeah, there's actually a big five inside of character adaptation systems, which is now located in relationship to the McAdams and Pals. But it's also the case that we can arrange the Rogers, Freud, Beck, or the behavioral, experiential, neo-humanistic, psychodynamic, and cognitive perspectives then get aligned with these systems of adaptation.
Right.
So now what I'm doing, basically, when I wondered about the problem of psychotherapy, I thought that we could have a map or model of human psychology that would afford us a way of looking at all these different perspectives. Just like human biology, what, you know, medicine does get a lot of things right. It looks at you as a whole organism, and then it narrates the various dimensional systems that you have. You have a digestive system, you have a muscular system, you have a respiratory system. Well, my analogy is actually the mental health people with their disorganization have been focusing on certain systems of adaptation, developing psychotechnologies, but we had not developed the map of human mental behavior that afforded the interrelations of the systems. And you can put them together in a very similar way that the body is put together in relationship to that, having different organ systems that affords then a picture of the whole in their interrelation. So that's what character adaptation systems engenders. And I also then argued, we can put, and so the work, why is the work relevant here? If we add the John Vervaeke map of the self that we've just went through, actually the habit system into the basic neurobiological architecture, the emergence of valence qualia, the mapping of a relationship system up top of the justification, that's actually a very, very tight line.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Gregg. It's very beautiful. And it gives I was going to say reciprocal opening ultimately relies on some, affording model, worldview model of the agent arena relationship.
Absolutely. Totally.
Right? Wow.
So the last thing then I'll say is then that this is an engine. And then what will ultimately develop, if you go back to identity and traits, you see in the McAdams and Pels, hey, there are ways in which maybe I'm going to argue that this is actually sort of the rotating wheel upon which adaptation and development occurs. And then there are different domains of development that we can then track somebody's personal development around. And that gives rise to this model, which is the wheel of development. And it's a wheel in the sense that it's supposed to be turning to capture the idea that a person is developing over time. The center of it is this character adaptation systems model. So we're always in agent arena relations, and all of the capacities that we build emerge out of that. But when we then look at the domains, we can then see that actually, and I don't mean this to have like a precise domain, but 5 large domains present themselves in relationship to this this element that then we can, just in terms of utility of remembering, we can then divide them up into particular aspects. So dispositional traits then, I argue, to be essentially set points in various tendencies that emerge. And of course, the big 5 we're pretty familiar with. John, you might be interested to note that the big 5, in my view, very much align with this particular model, such that extroversion and neuroticism afford us a picture of negative affect and positive affect, and the idling of those systems. Extroversion does pull into the relationship system some, but we can see agreeableness, sort of the dimensionality of whether you're other-oriented, self-oriented, hostile, defensive, etc. And then really conscientiousness and openness, or whether or not you're sort of conservative, ordered, structured in a particular way, or flexible and exploratory. That gets that plasticity around the frontal lobe regulation of the higher cognitive structures in relationship to the more animalistic ones. So the modeling about where these systems emerge relative to the systems of adaptation, I think, are actually quite tight.
Yeah, no, that looks very tight, Greg. That looks very tight.
So, and then in terms of identity, this then gets into, we can now assess, if we have a model of sort of, okay, what is the experiential self model? If we know what the parts of it, we can then take a look. Okay, so what's the affective valence, right? What is the influence matrix? Where is the person in relationship to their attachment structures? How competent do they feel? Where does their attentional adverbial consciousness jump around? And then how, and then how does that narrator organize with complexity and coherence, or defensiveness and rigidity? How does the narrator tell the story of the self, both to itself and to other people? So we can then build these models of identity. Okay, so what's the basic structure of self-concept? How reflectively aware is it? Is it able to shine the light on the system and say, hey, I've had many people, so tell me how you're feeling. I don't know, just no capacity. Alexithymia is the term we use. Like, you have no capacity to shine the inner light. We talk about, Wilbur or Lovinger or any number of models of ego development, agency, self-control, complexity and coherence. And there are a lot of different angles on this, but we can then really utilize, we can then have the assessment.
There's so much connection with so many of the dimensions we were talking about.
That's the 100%. And if we go back to psychiatry, and so we want to basically make a commentary that psychological mental health confusion coupled with psychiatry and its attachment to medicine gives rise to a model of struggling, right? That is painfully reductive and over medicalized, and gives rise to other naive romantic views of, oh, just be yourself and all this other stuff. There's an actual affordance of a very rich, complicated model that can inform our education. We can tie in Zach Stein's notions in relationship to this. Tie in how we can see ourselves, far more than traits, far more than chemicals, or far more than some romantic ideal that it's just me. So values and virtues, obviously there's a lot of work on positive psychology. We go back to Aristotle and a wide variety of different elements that would, restore notions along these lines. Abilities, Howard Gardner tried to get famous by calling them intelligences, but there are domains of ability, music. And then finally, there's pathology. Recently, there is a move in psychology to talk about really developing a taxonomy that's psychopathology that's grounded a lot more in research and meta-analyses of various different domains. So The wheel of character development, then basically what I'm suggesting is the following. I'm suggesting that actually the different approaches to psychotherapy track different patterns of adaptation. Okay?
Yep.
We can then see that, and then you can hone in on, action behavioral patterns. You can hone in on emotional patterns. You can hone in on relationship patterns, patterns of defense, patterns of justification. The field of personality, certainly, I think reflective members say, hey, there's a much broader domain. That McAdams and Powell's article said, wait a minute, there's these characteristic adaptations. These are all the learning procedures that people engage in. But actually, the lens of the unified theory said, wait a minute, there are different systems of adaptation. We can organize those and put those as central. And then you actually have bridged a big picture of personality theory into psychotherapy with a degree of coherence that at least affords me a way of making sense out of the field.
So it sounds to me also like the language of systems of adaptation folds nicely into relevance realization theory, in which self-relevance is plugging into agency, autopoietic, autonomous, adaptive, right?
Totally. I mean, before I realized how to talk elegantly about it, I talked about it in terms of behavioral investment, right? Which essentially is, the agent arena environment relationship in a context of investment and return on investment. And now with the architecture of recursive relevance realization, you now find, especially now that it maps up with the really neurobiological bottom-up predictive processing models, now have a very, very tight overall agent arena relation, bring basic behavioral and evolutionary learning, now bring tight neurobiological research, and then bring tight and expansive cognitive science to bear. All that stacks brilliantly. And I think it affords us a very, very clear and tight model.
I agree. And I think it's a rigorous model. And it's a model that is much more reflective of the human reality and therefore much more conducive to effective intervention in human transformation and change.
Amen. Yes. So anyway, that's a model of sort of how I want to map character functioning and adaptation, what it means to me clinically, and then what the implications are, both for the clinic room and how we think about mental troubles. And certainly there's a lot more to be said about that, but this just lays it out. But ultimately also what it means, set the stage for thinking about what it might mean for us as a society and how we existentially live our lives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this model, again, I'm just so impressed by your ability to do this kind of systematization and then integrate it with the work that's been done here. It's continually impressive.
Thank you.
And the elegance of it. But I mean, it's a model which reaches down into psychopathology and up to the meaning crisis. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this model. Totally.
Thank you.
Gregg, I have a question. Did you want to say something else before we go on?
Yeah, no, I have one last slide, and then that will wrap it up. But I basically, I'm getting to the point where this is the model stuff that I wanted to share with you.
Okay, go for your last slide, Gregg, and then I got a question for you.
Okay. So the last thing that I'll say in relationship to this, we talked about the well-being piece, and then this gets into, well, what is the implication? So this is the understanding structure, and of course, there's an enormous amount to say about this, but there are really clear guiding principles of what this says in relationship to how we think about what goes wrong, both inside people and outside of people. So the last model I'll share with you is this COM-MO model of, which the central issue is, I don't believe our society knows how to deal with negative feelings. So I feel very bad for individuals that have high trait neuroticism, okay? And then a relationship system, which often, by the way, is very kind to individuals, but often kind systems often hypersensitive and they over-victimize and they over-sensitize to injury in a particular way. So what I like to tell people is, listen, if you're an 8-year-old kid and you're learning to ride your bike and you fall off and you cut your knee, okay, where you go from that, how you manage that can go anywhere from, quit your whining, kid, shut the hell up and get on the bike, which then structures one particular relation, to, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You don't ever have to get on that bike again. I would never want you to cut your knee. That's so horrible. Look at all that blood. Do we need stitches? Should I take you to the doctor? Okay. So you overshoot in a particular way and you'll over-evaluate. You undershoot and you'll cut it off. There's a particular attachment holding environment for negative affect that's healthy, okay? And we want to be able to understand that the healthy thing will create a coherent, integrated self across the various levels. An unhealthy reaction fragments and disambiguates aspects of it, and then creates all sorts of psychic energy requirement that's defensive and ready to go on a threat module. Okay, and that's what we see. People are anxious, depressed, threat-ridden, defensive, and rigid in relationship to their structure. So you feel lousy, and then if you're like, I hate feeling this way, there's some negative reaction to the negative feeling. Okay, and this is the architecture of a neurotic loop.
Yeah.
So you got a narrator. Now you have a secondary negative reaction to the reaction. So you feel the negative, then it creates anxiety, then you create the judgment, the blame of the environment, blame of self, any other types of things, and it layers itself on top of it. And basically, this negative, you can see here what we call negative loop battle of avoidance and control on the one hand. So you try to block it. The internal critic is bitter. You try to block the feelings. This actually then builds up. So we talked about the episodic memories. Okay?
Yeah.
So we know from things like semantic associative network theory, one of the flags that we flag our feelings on, our memories on, are feelings. Okay. So what happens is people jam in the closet of their shadow. Let's say somebody doesn't want to feel shame. I mentioned in one time, remember I said I didn't cry for a long time. I put in my, my shadow in the closet, sadness. Sadness for me then meant weakness and lacking immense masculine agency and a capacity to solve problems. So I didn't feel that. And then when I then was resistant to it, I'd then feel a sense of avoidance and control.
Right.
And what happens in relationship to that, though, is those signals do not communicate what they need to say, and they build as unmetabolized feelings. And it'd be fascinating, really. I think this is actually operative at some neurobiological energetic store level. It'd be really fascinating to see. But you certainly can do the metaphor of the stacking, okay? And then what will happen is somebody who tries to avoid the feeling, they believe they can't handle it, they shouldn't handle it, and then a trigger happens so that there's enough activation, and then what happens is you get flooded and overwhelmed. Okay? Right. So then the systems run, and all of the associations of those systems pour out onto the thing, and usually you get some weeping, you get rage, you get panic, or you get complete despair. And then when you overload the system, then you get massive reciprocal narrowing, because affects are pretty short term in terms of what they're looking at. And you collapse yourself. They're also quite impulsive. They want to communicate, but they also want action. You often then engender things like you break something, or you hide in your room, or you embarrass yourself horribly in front of people. And of course, what does that do is it teaches the second order system is I knew these feelings were bad.
Right.
Right? And then they got to get back in. Once they run their course, then you jam them back into the closet. So we see this all the time. So what does it mean? Basically, what it means is the self, we got to create a stacked experience where, on the one hand, that I and narrator are aware and attuned of those feeling systems. And on the other hand, they understand the long-term consequence, the imaginal space, the image-based space, the possible space, and you cultivate an adaptive regulation of those impulses. Okay?
Right.
So essentially, this is what we call the emotional sweet spot in relationship to the positive opponent process of holding awareness and affect with awareness and attunement, and at the same time, cultivating an adaptive regulation as it integrates into the system.
It's kind of an optimal grip on yourself.
It's an optimal grip on your affect, exactly, on the self, and which of course affect is responding to self-world changes and expectations. And so ultimately, the calm MO approach to integrative psychological mindfulness says, hey, we need a metacognitive observer. So step outside the stream, take your lenses off that you're looking through, look at them, right? Do the Vervaeke, look at them, and adopt a metacognitive frame shift to see yourself in a particular way, okay? Cultivate, we want to train actually this capacity as a modus operandi. That's doubles for calm MO. And we want to then be curious with wonderment. Isn't it interesting that this is so injurious to me? Not like I hate this, I feel lousy. I wonder why. And isn't it interesting that this is part of my experience? Okay. The capacity to accept pain. So the Buddhists, famously characterize suffering as the combination of pain times resistance. So resistance would be sort of the opposite of acceptance. A loving compassion, a meta MTTA view of the world, oneself and one's other. And then a motivated toward valued states of being, which ultimately also means, by the way, in terms of philosophy and existential reflection, we need deep reflections on what is optimal for us, what's realistic, what is optimal, what's optimal for us, what's optimal for the relational world we're in, what's optimal for our culture and society. But another picture I can engender now is John's picture. So we can be, calm MO in relationship to the structures of the self as John laid out for us. And so my bottom line is, when somebody comes in, they have their particular narrative. She brings her narrative. That's her unique narrative of understanding and unique position in the world. And I needed a system that afforded me what I thought would be the most comprehensive, conciliant, and coherent package that would afford me to engender a wise, but also a wise system that would afford her the capacity to transition from the maladaptive, reciprocally narrowing states into an open and hopefully virtuous, adaptive and more optimal state of being. And that's basically the way I frame my psychotherapy work.
That was beautiful. I've already given my response. I'll open things up to Chris.
So.
Yeah, that was impressive, Greg. I'm gonna have to look at that again to digest it in its totality. I'm glad I waited. Actually, I'm glad I waited because my question has more to do with what you've just presented with the calm MO, and it has to do with the role of the relationship between the character adaptation systems and the role of fellowship. Which I think is where Dialogos is premised, right?
Yep.
Is at that intersection. And one of the things that's, I think, most striking about Maggie's story as you narrated it is the role that's played, obviously by yourself as a therapist, but also the role that's played by her friends and the role that's played by her mother in the course of the events. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that how the disclosure of that event to her mother affected such a profound shift in the realism of the event in the way she was able to apprehend it.
Totally.
And the way that then returned into the therapeutic process. Because it occurs to me that one of the ways that we gain a purchase on the experiential realism of ourselves is via the surrogate perspective of our fellows in the light of their recognition. Right? There is a close connection between that recognition and that realism. And I think it has to do with the capacity to the capacity to vary and graduate the level of narration and to vary it effectively, right? So, in a situation in which my sense of myself's narration is very confined, the easiest way, the most ready-to-hand way of widening the ambit of possibility that narration can operate within is to outsource my perspective to someone that knows and recognizes me finely, so that suddenly I can maintain the realism that you might associate with the self-flagellating neuroticism. I don't want suddenly to try and evolve myself into fantasy that's going to just pull me further away from what I know to be true of myself, especially when it's unflattering. Totally. So that the connection with the close fellow, maintains the realism so as not to so that it can operate, so that it can be conversant with the neuroticism, but also provides the capacity to widen and refresh the perspective such that the realism can actually be continuous with the possibility of being more. Because I think that the role of friendship, for instance, one of the roles of friendship, I think, is to mediate the relationship between what you've described as the crosshairs of the personality, right? The part of us that's irreducibly unique, and the part of us that's protein, right? And so the role of so if I could put it in a slogan, it would be something like, the way that we optimally grip ourselves is often with the hands of our fellows.
Love it.
Right? And it seems to me that had a pretty decisive role in not just the case study that you've just described, but has a pretty fundamental role in being able to maintain that connection in any case.
It's unbelievable. I mean, so to me, the core fundamentally nourishing need of the soul is the need to be known and valued in the relational system. Okay. So that's am I known and valued by important others? That's a full belly as opposed to an empty belly. So it's absolutely foundational at that level. And of course, how that is framed and how that's cultivated both is the internal process of what it is that I experience myself as and how I model and narrate myself. And at the same time, it's also constituted by the interpersonal feedback loops of the other. And the opportunity to have virtuous cycles within and virtuous cycles between others is the honorable fellowship of genuine, authentic relation and connection and the fulfillment of the human soul, basically. The absence of it, either inside or between, and the potential vicious. So let's look at what happened to this woman. Okay, so she goes out and she's raped. Okay, so date rape, basically, classic kind of nightmare scenario, but forced upon, virgin. She's a virgin, so she loses her virginity in this context. All right, and then you come home, okay, and your biological structure as a female, which is obviously if you take a little bit of an evolutionary psych to actually engender the honoring of this, that the signal that you have basically just been devalued, okay, that you've had something stolen from you, is embodied in every cell of your body at that juncture. Okay, so the signal of is like, oh my God, you've been completely violated and treated with an enormous amount of indignancy. That's what, and now what the system now wants to basically do is that my reality? Okay, I mean, or was this an aberration that I can restore to some degree of secure expectation? And the answer then is, not only did that happen, but now the internalized narrative is, oh my God, the projecting model is I can't face my parents based on that and have them see me this way. And I then project that no one will be able to tolerate it, so that I'll get blamed for sneaking out and drinking as well. Okay. Basically, the entire message is you are there to be used and devalued. And there is no retribution and there's no honoring of the self. So it's a complete catastrophe at every level, at the narrating level, at the cellular level, the relational level, that you are not valued, okay? And you have no value. And indeed, when the thing reverses itself, okay, what emerges is, oh my God, and this is what I tried to drop in her, is that a lot of the consequence of this emptiness is in fact not necessarily in the world itself, but is in the reciprocal narrowing process of the interpretive relevance realization, not using those terms back then, but basically, and when I told her, I said, I think that your mother may think differently about this than you do, okay? You could tell she had the hope. And then my job was to cultivate that hope, check with mother to see if it happened, and realize the desire in a realistic way, and create the potential and the awareness without self-blame that actually a lot of the script of her misery have been a function of the way she's narrated and react and anticipated. So then what happens to her, and the reason it was a massive phase shift, is like, oh my God, yes, mom actually loved me all along. And B, it was the way I withhold her that she withheld to me, and we never resolved this. And C, this was a lot in my head, and my doctor has told me with clarity why this vicious cycle happens to a lot of people and why the nature of the self is such that we're vulnerable to it. And oh my God, it's sort of like an allergic reaction only at the level of psychology. And we can afford an understanding of that without massive self-blame, but at the same time afford agency, engagement, and being. And boom, I mean, the significant implications of her life in the 3 months that followed that particular intervention was, well, we talk about sudden gains in therapy, and there's no doubt that that was a sudden gain and transformational shift in the fundamental architecture of her self-other model across many, many different modes.
So Chris, thank you, Gregg, by the way, that was excellent.
Yeah.
I also got a sense that and I think this is consonant with everything Gregg said, you're positioning the self as sort of the intersection between the inner dialogue and the outer dialogue, right? And the part of what the self is trying to do is find sort of a bidimensional optimal grip on those, right? So that it's making sure this is looping well, and it's making sure this is looping well, and those gears are not grinding against each other, if I can speak metaphorically so I can speak quickly. I was picking up that in what you were putting an emphasis on. If that's the case, then that provokes a question to both of you, because I think it has both an existential and a clinical dimensionality to it, dimension to it, which is, it seems to me that we could be deeply confused of, I'll use the neutral term discourse to, when I'm making noises come out of my face hole towards other people, okay? We can be confused between that as communication and that as communing. Because what I heard Gregg saying is that people actually want the communing, but very often I think people can get stuck at the communication level because the inner filters are locking them at this level, the justification level. And so they can't drop down to the machinery they need to access for communing. And then that means they can't get the external dialogue of communing, and they're locked into communication. So they're locked into communication this way, and then that gets them locks them into which, like, it gets them locked up into the sort of the justification level, right? And then basically that's a very hard place to get stuck in. And then the culture is reinforcing that by telling them what matters most about you is your propositions and your ideology. And so the question that emerges is, I can see how an inability to properly discern the relationship between communication and communing could, well, I want to turn it into a question. Is it not the case that that would, like, infect, I'm trying to come up with a verb here, infect the self in a profound way? So, I mean, I don't want to remove the idiosyncratic causal events in people's lives and the trauma, but I'm also talking about sort of a structural functional thing that's going wrong, that's being reinforced by the society, is where people are, they can't distinguish and properly relate communication and communing.
Totally. My history on deciphering the influence matrix might help this a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's called the influence matrix because when I was first putting it in, I was putting in pretty instrumental evolutionary psychology terms. Okay. Right. And hey, to what extent can I influence both of you in accordance with my interests? You know, and then will you expend work energy, and where am I? And that puts me in status and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Which is totally legitimate and an important thing. However, there's a fundamental, what emerged to me when I saw in the clinical world is that many people, you know, would be able to have influence or be influenced by others and resent the shit out of it. Right.
Right. Right.
Okay. So if you create contingencies and I get you because I have some power over you, and then I force you to tell me you love me, okay, you know, then I can influence you, but you don't value me. And that's a very then precarious state of being. So a much better space. So it went from social influence to relational value. Okay? Right. So then it's like this felt sense of, actually, I'm in a much better state when you guys actually care about me. Mm-hmm. All right. So that's fundamentally different in relationship. And by the way, in a society that now excessively instrumentalizes and then creates capital labor relationships around every outcome that's unmeasurable, you've actually now confounded influence with relational value potentially that way. That's a big issue. And then the final move I made was, wait a minute, a number of people have influence and are valued, but they are not known. Yeah. Okay? Exactly. So I talk about known and valued because they put on the public face, because of the weird dynamic of justification, which means I can tell you because I think you want to hear, and then you love me for me telling you what I think you want to hear. Now you do love me, and I have influence, but you don't know who I really am. Okay. And then that means I'm stuck up here in performative communication acts, but I'm not anchored into the authentic process of communion with being known and valued in place.
I see that. That's a fantastically clear mapping. So I'm wondering if the tendency in our culture, which you just alluded to use univariate measures of the entire human being is also contributing to that collapse. Like we take what's the measure of the measure of the economy is the one thing, the GDP or something like that. What's the measure of a person? Well, what's their wealth? What's their socioeconomic status? Like we have these univariate measures that collapse. I mean, I think that what the three of us have been doing over these last 10 episodes is, you know, slowly opening up the dimensionality of the self, all right, and unpacking it and distinguishing it and then relating it, you know, basically complexifying it, and then we're right, and then we're in a culture that takes univariate measures that just collapse all that dimensionality down. And how could people within that kind of univariate measures, how could they pull things apart the way they need to in order to get the things that you're talking about, Gregg? It seems to me that it's going to be just increasingly difficult for them to do that.
Right. It's a nightmare at the level of society. Okay. And I'll come back to actually psychology and my annoyance with what psychology did. Okay. Our failure to understand ontology and our needs for scientific epistemology. For much of psychology, what they ended up doing is, we'll survey aggregate individuals and find variables and do variable cluster analysis, okay?
Right.
With no fucking map of the self and the individual dynamics that actually then have to be translated. So then we get particulate variable aggregate relations and tell everybody, hey, this little recipe was found to work out here, with no understanding about how to metabolize that in the dynamic complex variable relation. So we're doing this at multiple levels. We're just flooding people with particulate pieces of information that's not up to the dynamic task of the interrelations of the dimensions, and not cultivating in people a way to engender the intersection of these in an optimal way. I mean, we just don't do any of that.
Chris, this just reminds me so much of Kierkegaard and the way human beings are sort of like, in his ideas about sin and the sickness unto death, that the way human beings are just being rendered, because, with the Kierkegaard I read, he often gives portrayals of individuals who have collapsed to one-dimensionality of their humanity, and they get stuck there in a profound way. And then, and then of course he does have a critique. He calls it Christendom, but he has a cultural level critique of that flattening all over the place.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into that because we'll talk about that next time. But yes.
Right. Well, that's a great segue, right?
That's a great segue then. That's a great segue then.
Transition. That's what my hope was, is that we could lay the clinical table and set up the existential implication.
Well, that sounds like the bridging point has just been well made. Sorry, that was self-congratulatory, but
it was well made, John. That's good. That's okay.
So I think this has been a long one, but I think the length is completely justified. But I think we should wrap it up for today. That was my final thing to say. What I just said, the foreshadowing of the connection to Kierkegaard and what the things Chris is going to bring to the fore next week. Is there anything more, Chris or Gregg, that you either you want to say?
For me, no. I swallowed a lot of comments I had along the way as I was engulfed in the tide of Gregg's systematic brilliance. So,
well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
So I got nothing.
Well, it's a joy to be able to pick up the baton from John in relation to cognitive science. I hope I conveyed why I care about this.
Very well.
Embodied, man. Yeah. And then set it up from sort of a psychological health perspective. And, I am debating whether to get my clinical license, in part as a statement, because I really believe the time is about a meta psychological meaning and deep existential questions. And so, Chris, I really look forward to your reflections on that issue as we transition.
Thank you, Gregg. Well, you teed it up beautifully. I'm very grateful.
I hope, Gregg, that you felt me reciprocating why you care about my work. I think
absolutely
why I was caring about yours.
Amen. Yeah. Amen. Lots of care. Heidegger would be proud.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right, guys.
We will pick it up next week, and we will pass the baton to Chris.
Perfect.